Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is David Wortley. I'm the Virtual Conferences Director at IOLMA Global Consumer Commerce. I'd just like to say a little bit about IOLMA before we start. IOLMA is a global consumer commerce centre, and it's a neutral resource for businesses and governments that recognises their needs to understand the response to the ways in which the 7.8 billion global consumers are changing. And they're changing in the products and services they want and need and the ways in which they want to obtain them. And these changes are happening globally, and they're driven by developments in society, in business, and in technology. This webinar is one of a series of thought leadership discussions held every other Thursday. And the topics are chosen from IOLMA's Horizon Scanning, its surveys, and its research. I'd like just to remind you from a housekeeping point of view that we do encourage you to type in questions throughout the webinar. Please use the Q&A button to type in your questions rather than the chat because it makes it that much easier to deal with. I'm going to start now by having a polling question, and then I will ask all of our panelists to introduce themselves. Just bring the gallery view up and bring up the polling question. So we bring a polling question up now, and what we'd like to ask you, the first poll has got 3 questions, and I'm going to launch the poll now. And the first of these questions really is to find about how much you think you know about gamification. Do you know nothing? Do you know very little? A bit, quite a lot, or pretty much everything? And following on from that, we want to ask you whether you've actually used gamification yourselves in your business life or in your personal life. And I'll give a minute or two for people to reply to those questions. Okay, so we've got quite a few responses. Well, most of you know a bit, and quite a few of you know quite a lot. Well, that's encouraging. You'll be able to give us some feedback and response to our panelists. And about half of you say you've used gamification in your business life, and similar numbers within your personal life. Well, that gives us a good starting point to work on. So I'm going to close the poll now, just share the results with you so that you can see what we've said. Yeah, so you do know quite a bit about gamification, and at least half of you reckon that you've used gamification in your business and your personal lives. So now I'm going to turn to our panelists. I'm going to ask each of them to say a little bit about themselves, just a brief introduction about themselves and their interest and background in gamification. So I'm going to start with Lucia Panese. Lucia, would you like to say something about yourself?
Hi, David. Hello. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name is Lucia Pannese. I'm Italian, actually. I'm the CEO of a company based in Milano called Imaginary. And my background is in mathematics. And 18 years ago, I started this company. And well, the interest in gamification is quite easy to understand because the company is working on serious games. Mainly for health and training, but also for other topics sometimes. So gamification is very close to games and all related technologies. And I really believe there's a sort of soft flow between the concepts of games and gamification sometimes.
Thank you, Lucia. I'm now going to go across literally to the other side of the world, to Melbourne in Australia, where Luke has kindly stayed up to be with us this afternoon. So Luke,
hi, everyone.
Tell us about yourself.
Hi, yeah, so look, my background is, I have a corporate background. I spent sort of 15 odd years in that corporate space where I believed that people wanted to get up and do a good job. And I recognized and realized that there was a whole heap of different personality types that we just weren't recognizing across a corporate space. And that's where my interest around gamification started from. And I started to design and build gamification frameworks to help motivate the teams, the large teams that I ran. And after many years, I decided to do some consulting, which eventually led me in the gamification space, but then it then eventually led me to the role that I sit in now, which is the regional director for Centrical, which is a gamification and micro-learning platform. So it all sort of came to this point at this stage.
Thanks very much, Luke, and thanks for joining us at this obscene hour in your time scale. Helen, tell us about yourself and gamification.
Hi everyone, thanks David. I've got to say, Luke, I love your background. I love your art. Hi, I'm CEO of Totem Learning. We are a serious games and gamification specialist company based in the UK, so it's great for the international panel here. I'm a psychologist by background and a big fan of games, and I agree with what Lucia said. There's so much crossover, and essentially game designers are brilliant at psychology and getting you to keep playing. So I've been in the serious games and gamification space for about 20 years now. Started off, as you might imagine, as a psychologist in research, looking at how effective these tools can be and the impact they really can make. And I always say I've done every job in the industry that's not programming and art over the last 20 years. So it's been great fun. But yeah, I mean, I'm all about bringing learning to life, making learning engaging, making it memorable, making it enjoyable, and ultimately making that impact to the business that we're all looking for from a learning and development point of view. As you might imagine, as a psychologist in research.
Thank you very much for that, Helen. I think we have a bit of sound noise in the background, but anyway, so now we're underway. I want to begin with a series of questions, really, and I really want to try and engage the audience in this. I did say in the promotional material that we wanted to try and gamify this webinar. We've adopted a few gamification tactics to try and engage people to sign up for the event, but during the event itself, we might well be using gamification and perhaps showing an example. I'm holding up some cards, and number two, the green one is Lucia, the yellow one is Luke, and the red one is Helen. So when it comes to asking a question, I might use a gamification tactic and pick one of these cards at random and ask that person whose card is the color to answer that question. So now, to start with, I want to ask each of the panelists to give, in a very short and concise way, how they would define gamification and what it actually means. And I'll start maybe by just floating the thought that a game is a challenge with uncertain outcomes. That's how I describe a game, and I would describe gamification as a process of introducing either the challenge, the uncertainty, or the outcome into any given situation. But now I'm going to go to Lucia, and I'm going to do them in the same order and ask Lucia what her views on gamification is. How would you define it, and what does it mean to you?
Well, in my opinion, on the one hand side, gamification I could call is a life skill, because we find it also in nature, we find it in animals, we find it in processes which we wouldn't suspect if we don't really look at that. And I would say gamification is about motivating people and influencing behaviors. It's all about personalization, and in a way it's introducing game elements into processes that map everyday activities.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Lucia. I'm now going to Luke and ask him the same question. How would you define gamification, Luke?
I don't want to go and say the same thing Lucia just said, because and I think that was really great answer. But to give a slightly different spin, what I think gamification also does is it creates a space for us to be more creative, more innovative. And it actually allows us to disconnect ourselves from reality in a way, and to be able to play and create a safe space for us to be able to progress, take on challenges, and enjoy the things that may not be all that enjoyable in life sometimes.
Okay, that's a good answer, and I just reflect on your answer to that by saying one of the best examples of early examples of gamification that I saw was when somebody was doing a presentation and they referred to the film Mary Poppins. And the song "A Spoonful of Sugar Helps the Medicine Goes Down" as a way of gamifying the unpleasant task of taking medicine. So Helen, I'm going to you now. How would you define gamification?
Yeah, I love that analogy with Mary Poppins. But yeah, I've used similar techniques to convince my son to do unpleasant things that he doesn't want to do. But yeah, I mean, for us, it's about bringing something to life and giving you additional reasons to maybe do something. So I don't want to, again, repeat what Lucia and Luke have said, because again, we completely agree. Yeah, for us, it's about bringing experiences to life, giving you different perspectives, being able to create complex systems and worlds and characters that you might not have the opportunity to experience, wherever you are. And for us, it's about understanding how we learn as humans, and tapping into how the brain works. And games are just perfect for that. Our brains love games.
Oh, I must say that I love this panel because their answers are so concise, and they're not talking for 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, so I have to worry about the time scales. That's a big relief as a moderator. But now I'm going to have my first attempt at gamifying this webinar, and so instead of asking the panelists in the order that they are shown on the program, I'm going to pick one of the cards at random. So I'm holding up I can't see which color is which, so I'm just going to pick a card. It's the yellow card, which I guess was, from memory, was Luke. So Luke, I'm going to ask you this question. Luke, can you just give an example, a case study from your own work and your experience of how gamification has been applied successfully, and what kind of outcomes, or not even necessarily successfully? It might be a case study where it turned out wrong. But what can you give us as a case study example?
Yeah, thanks, David. I knew I was going to get picked first, and I was always in the yellow team at school, so it's meant to be. Now, look, there's been plenty of times that I have failed. I mean, my early attempts at gamification were an absolute disaster, and so I remember that when I tried to roll it out sort of the second and third time, and people had asked me, "Has this worked before?" And I so sheepishly had to say no, it hadn't, but I believe in it, and let's give it a crack anyway. And eventually we kind of worked through the bugs, and a practical example that really worked well for me, and the reason I loved gamification, is it applies to all of us. It is around behavioral psychology, and some of the challenges we face, particularly in a corporate space, is that metrics are designed sort of often at the top level and then broken down into widgets and asked to be distributed down and down and down until the people at the very bottom have these widgets they have to just push out in order to achieve their job, and that's not all that motivating. And so it was about trying to find the behaviors that linked the different types of players to the meaning of what they had to do, and applying that meaning. And there's plenty of profiling tools out there, and I've created my own to try and understand sort of these brackets we fall into. But the beautiful thing is, and that I love about sort of the gamification profiling, if you want to call it, is that we might have a preference for one particular area, but as we play games, we start to build the strengths in others, and we become more well-rounded. And in a corporate sense, that's really valuable, because when you look around in these large organizations, there is a wide variety of people and diversity, and gamification allowed us to tap into all of that diversity and harness that collective power, that collective energy of people and their strengths, and apply them towards common goals, which didn't necessarily always align to the KPI, but the behaviors did. And that's the great thing about gamification, is that it measures behaviors, not always just outputs. And that's where I loved it and saw it work.
So as a case study example, can you give us an example of a particular challenge or a situation where you use gamification, and what did you do and how did you apply it?
Yeah, so this was a contact center scenario, and the scenario was that we had metrics that kind of clashed against each other, and this is pretty typical for many contact centers, where you've got quality versus quantity. And what we found was that there was people within our organization that were subject matter experts. They were maybe older in their career and weren't feeling valued, or that knowledge wasn't feeling valued. But then we had these young people who didn't have that knowledge, but were eager and were trying to do things quickly. And what we're trying to do is trying to find a way to bring those two skills together, so that we're sort of finding a balance. And in order to do that, what we would do is we would say that the subject matter experts, they were really driven to share, and felt rewarded when they shared. So we created some game mechanics and rewards that actually rewarded people sharing their knowledge. But then we would also reward people for being, high achievers and, winning and the likes. And so it was taking these game mechanics of things like winning competitions, but also sharing knowledge, and we held them in equal esteem. And so what was happening is that the two different types of players were both being recognized, and all of a sudden we saw a much better uplift in both quality and productivity across the board.
So you've seen genuine improvements in productivity and performance in that situation of a call center. I'm now going to go over to Helen and ask her if she could tell us about a case study that she's been involved in where gamification has been applied, either successfully or unsuccessfully.
Brilliant. Yeah, I mean, there's so many to choose from, but I think one of my favorites is because often we get approached to look at courses that aren't performing very well in our clients, and they're usually the slightly dry courses. And so we were once approached to make auditing fun and engaging. And this is one of my favorites, because you've got to be quite interested in auditing to make it quite engaging. And how on earth do you start to do that? So where we started working was looking at what the client had in place at that time. It was a fully classroom-based course. Instructors, their model was they flew 2,000 interns into one location. It was a hotel in Orlando. Nice gig if you could get it, because you get a week away in the sunny climes of Florida. And these are people from all over the world. And what they were given at the start of the week was a really big box of paper, and they had to audit the paper over a week. So not the most engaging course, unless you absolutely are an admin fan, not the most exciting thing. So what we did was we thought, well, can we create a virtual scenario? Can we create a storyline around this paper, around these accounts? What went into the accounts? What's maybe missing from those numbers, and how would an intern start to work through them and find them? And so we created a game. It turned out it was 6 hours long, so it wasn't a light game. It was very intense. And we blended that with instructor-led training. So that was really important, that you still had the experienced auditors helping you and guiding you through the activity. But a lot of it was down to the interns and the choices they made. And then there was also lots of peer learning as well, because that's really, really important, because games don't work in isolation. There are communities that live around them, and to be able to talk about your experiences and your choices is a really valuable activity to put around a game. And so what we did is we tried to mimic the real world as much as possible. So yeah, absolutely, we created online accounts, we created characters, but you had to talk to the characters in a realistic way as well. So now, auditors aren't the most liked person coming into a company because they're there to find problems, and often they're put into a broom cupboard. They're not treated in the best way, but the auditor themselves has to remain polite, professional, and find the information. So we built in a lot of soft skills to combine with the hard skills. And so that was really, really important. And what we found was that obviously we were able to reduce waste. So we cut out the big box of paper, the printing costs, you know, so there's a nice big green tick on that from the start. We were able to reduce the course length from 6 days to 4 days, or about 3.5 days in total. So again, the company saved a huge amount from an efficiency point of view. So they had less hotel bills, cheaper flights for when they could run the training. But what most importantly is that the learners themselves grew in confidence. So because they were able to actually practice an auditing skill with characters rather than just doing it literally on paper and ticking boxes, they felt so much more confident when they went out into the real world. And because it was an auditing client, they audited the course themselves and the work that we did. And so they tracked all these metrics, and they audited their customers as well. They measured the customer satisfaction rates, and they went up. They went up dramatically. And so, you know, we managed to make it more efficient, and we managed to make the learners feel more confident, and the customers at the end of the day, because they're the ultimate measure. Are your customers happier? Can you do a better job? And so they were incredibly happy. And so the game itself, I'll give you some numbers to contextualize it. The game itself cost around $200,000. It was part of an overall change program that was around $600,000. So it wasn't a low-end change program. The company were putting a lot into this, but the return on the investment of the overall program was $13 million in the first year, and the program ran for 5 years. So that, in my mind, is one of my favorites. You know, it's all for us. It's all about bringing learning to life, making learning feel real, immersive, being able to connect, and making a real difference to the bottom line. So that's my favorite example of gamification.
I think it's a very good example as well. And I've never been audited. I never have done any auditing, but I can identify with the situation that you described, and I can see the benefits also that you've described. So I'm now going to go to Lucia and ask her to give us an example of how they have applied gamification in their work. Lucia.
Yes, I guess I have a very, very different scenario to tell you here. You know, we work a lot in R&D, so a lot of research projects. And I guess one of my favorite examples is an old project where we were studying digital solutions for elderly, fragile people, possibly with MCI, so mild cognitive impairment, and comorbidities, so actually fragile people. And the aim was to sort of trigger them both cognitively and from the motor point of view, so making them do some sort of soft gymnastics or exercises to be a bit fitter. So we developed some games for this. And then the point was, again, how to bring them and motivate them on a constant base to actually play these games. Because one thing is if you take the person and sort of put the technology in front of him or her. The other side is if you want them to be motivated to use the games on their own, so empower them to use the games and engage with them. So we put up actually a social space which was based exactly on gamification. We studied what is motivating for elderly people of this kind, and actually we found out there are two recurring themes. One is pets, so a sort of dog or some sort of little animal being their companion, and the other topic was travel. So we decided that the social space was going to be a dog traveling Europe for the user. So each time the person was playing some cognitive games or some motor games, so extra games, the dog would be like the old games we were playing when we were kids, so board games, would go on with the journey and drive or travel from one city to the next one. And for each city, we had some sort of highlights. So I don't know, for Milano, we had the Duomo or the castle and stuff like that, or Paris, the Tour Eiffel, and so on. So for an amount of games played, the dog would travel all these places and send the person a postcard. So the elderly person would receive in their album a postcard from, say, the Duomo in Milano, with the dog in front of the Duomo and some sort of description of what the Duomo is, when it was built, and so on. So a little bit of tourism from remote. And the elderly people could place challenges. So I could challenge you, David, saying, hey, my dog is already in front of the Duomo in Milano, where are you? So let's see if you arrive to Paris first, or if I am quicker. So all this kind of mutual challenges were driving the gamification dynamics forward. This was working on the one hand side very well because they loved it. Also because, of course, the gamification framework was built on psychological motivational studies with the target users. On the other hand side, within the research project, you know, there are not too many users involved. So these kind of systems need ideally a larger population to work nicely, because if you have just 10 users using this system, it's quickly a bit boring or a bit small. So you don't have the critical mass to really drive the system forward. So in this sense, I could say it also failed a bit, but these are the constraints then of a research project.
Thanks very much for that, Lucia. I'll indulge myself slightly by giving you my example of gamification, and this goes back over 20 years. Before serious games was even a term. But my company at the time was involved in presentation services, and I got asked to help a company set up an exhibition stand in Prague at a conference on neurological problems, including epilepsy. And so the basic challenge was, how do we get people to visit our stand? And how do we get them to leave their business card or their details on our stand? And how do we try to make this entertaining and stand out from the rest of all the stands? And I'm sure you've all been around lots of conferences and exhibitions and seen them handing out sweets or cups of coffee and a jar with a business card. You could put your business card in and win a prize at the end of it. We did something slightly different. We had these little computer booths, or like a little kiosk with a touch screen, going back all that time, with a touch screen. And the idea, this was a quiz about epilepsy, and so it took the form of a series of random questions. But it began in order to take part in this competition, where the prize was a digital camera for the best performance. Before you could enter for the competition, you had to type in your details and your email address. But once you'd done that, you were given your first question about epilepsy, and they were a variety of different formats of these questions, either single choice or multiple choice. But if you got the answer right, you then came up with a card game. And I know Lucia's done this before with some of the gamification exercises she'd done. So this was a kind of card game where you have the cards with their face down, and you have to try and match two cards. So you pick two cards to begin with, and if they match, you got the chance to pick another two cards. So it tested your memory, and once you'd done that first card game, you came up with the next question. So the idea was to get as many questions right as you could, and turn over all of the cards during that part of the quiz. And you were given a 5-minute time limit to do that. And a scoring was based on how many questions you got right and how quickly you got all the cards out. And so we had these little kiosks, and there were 3 of them. So we had 3 people on the stand at the same time playing the game. But we also linked those kiosks to a large monitor on the stand, so that people would come and watch people compete against each other playing this game. And it turned out to be hugely successful in gathering leads and providing entertainment for people. Whether it would be as successful these days at the conferences, I have no idea, but that is my example. I now want to move on to a second polling question, which is to do with motivation. Now, we've already seen that all of our examples are related to psychological profiling and how to motivate people by using some of the tools available that actually tap into people's motivational instinct. So my next polling question is about motivation, and I'm going to bring up the next polling question, and this will ask you how you view motivation and what actually motivates you. So there are a couple of questions which I'll explain. I'm going to launch the poll now. Now, the first of these questions is to ask you, now, if you were given a choice between a webinar where you could win £100, or a webinar where you could learn a lot and make good contacts, which of these would you choose? Would you prefer to try for the £100? Or would you prefer to try to learn more and make new contacts? So that's the first polling question. The second polling question is about coronavirus. Now, coronavirus vaccines reduce the risk of infection or minimize the risk of dying. Now, if you were in charge of developing a policy to encourage adoption of vaccines, which gamification strategies would you adopt? And you can choose as many of these or as few of these as you like. Would it be offering people financial or other incentives, for example, pizza vouchers, launching a COVID mobile passport scheme to allow people to travel and go to events? Would you use social media influencers to promote vaccines? Or would you feature on broadcast examples of people who died or have suffered? Or would you offer insurance premium reductions to people who've been vaccinated, make vaccination a mandatory requirement for health workers, broadcast data on hospitalization and deaths from COVID, or broadcast figures on vaccination rates? So all of these are examples of gamification strategies that have already been tried in one form or another. So if you could let me know your thoughts, and I will share the results with you in a second. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll now. I'm going to share the results with you. Well, encouragingly, actually, the majority of people say they'd prefer to sign up for a webinar where they would learn more and make new contacts. And when it comes to the kinds of strategies that you could adopt, it's interesting, probably the highest rated one is the mobile passport scheme for travel and events. I'm going to stop sharing this in a second. And thank you for taking that poll. And we'll perhaps come back to discuss some of those answers shortly. I now want to move on because Helen has got to leave us at 2:45, unfortunately. But at 2:45, when Helen moves on, I'm going to introduce another person to the panel. It's Pete Jenkins, who teaches gamification at the University of Brighton. And he's sharing this webinar panel discussion with his students. So it'd be interesting to see what their reaction has been to what they've heard so far. I'm now going to move on to the next question, which is about how technology, what is the role of technology in gamification, and how can technology help and support gamification? Well, Helen, I'm going to go to you first, because you're the one that's got to move on in a little while, and ask you, how can you use technology to support gamification, and is it necessary always to use technology?
Good question. Yeah, thank you, David. Yeah, I've got the school run to do and then taking him to a swimming class. So the joys of mixing work and after school fun. Yeah, so no, absolutely not. Technology is not essential for gamification, but it does give us a lot of benefits. So one example, one of our clients didn't have a very sophisticated learning management system. So how on earth do they record scores at the end of the day? So people printed out their certificates and they literally pasted them on the wall, and then they could move someone else's certificate if they got a better score. And so, you know, there was a very physical aspect to that. So there's lots you can do without it. I mean, obviously we've talked about card games and board games and things like that. There's so many options out there. But how technology can support gamification, I think there are probably three key things I can think of. So, I mean, technology is a tool, isn't it? At the end of the day, it's about how we leverage it. And so, you know, it's never a replacement. It's always an augmentation to what we've got, and we should look at it as to how can we leverage this for the greater good. So the first thing I'd probably touch on is the scalability that technology gives us in this world. We've all experienced travel restrictions, working from home, and so, you know, face-to-face trainers have had to move online. They've had to scale their business online, and a lot of the ones that I talked to have actually managed to reach more people because they don't have to spend the time flying to another location or driving, and there's a lot of a time saved there. So, but what you also can do is you could take in an organization your best performing trainers who might have been on the road, and you could create a game that represents them, that takes a lot of their anecdotes, and then you start to standardize the training with your best trainers that are out there, so you can reach more at a higher scale. I think technology does give us an edge on engagement. It's not the be all and end all by any means, but it enables us to start to visualize things that we can't do in any other way. So, for example, we've created welding simulators where you could weld underwater. I mean, I would never get a chance to do that unless it was in a game. Or we could shrink down to the size, tiny size, and go inside a fat cell to see what's happening there, or into blood vessels. So I think that the ability to engage in things that are beyond our physical spaces is a real bonus of technology. And the last point, and I think this is a really important one, is around accessibility and democratization of learning. Now, obviously, we need to break down barriers, but we also need to recognize where there might be biases in the world. And at the end of the day, a game doesn't care who you are, where you've come from, what school you went to, what you look like. That game will just care whether you can actually do the job you're being asked to do. Can you do the task that's in front of you, and how well can you do it? And if you can't do it, just keep trying. And so I think the democratization aspect, the stripping away the human judgment that we often get in learning and development and talent identification, is a huge unexplored area that technology can bring us. You know, it can lead to so much with leveling up and giving people opportunities that they might not have right in front of them in their everyday world. So that's an incredibly, hugely exciting concept to me.
Thank you very much for that, Helen. I'm now going to go over to Luke and ask him what his views on the role of technology in gamification.
Yeah, and Helen, those answers are awesome. just fantastic. I thought they were lovely, and I think you touched on so many of the points that I sort of had, which was you do have this ability to scale. When I first started my interest in gamification, a lot of it was on whiteboards and on walls and cutting things out, and that's all good, and there's definitely a place for that. But there's a couple of things that has challenges with that. Is that how do you keep up the pace of that? How do you keep track of what's changed? How do you scale that? And technology plays a fantastic role in that. I think the other place that technology can really play a really great role is this whole idea of psychological safety. We can be our inner self in the game world. So I think there's this ability to have your avatar, and it doesn't have to look exactly like you. It can look like the person you want to be. You can unleash that inner ninja within yourself in your avatar. And so technology does play that space of creating that psychological safety. And in doing so, and I think this is where it sort of differs to, those, traditional tests in a classroom, you sit down, you get that pass fail. If you're not feeling prepared, you're probably less likely to take on some of those challenges. Whereas in a game-based environment, you feel like maybe there's less to lose. And so that can encourage people to actually take on challenges that they may not have done in, let's say, we'll call it a real world scenario. So I think technology definitely plays a part in, both scale and psychological safety.
Okay. Thanks very much for that, Luke. And finally, Lucia, I know your company uses technology a lot in your gamification strategy, particularly with products like Rehability. So what would you say about the use of technology in gamification?
Well, my colleagues didn't leave me a lot to say at this point. But anyway, first of all, I would say as well that technology is not mandatory, because, for example, you and I have been gamifying lots of workshops, David, at the times when we were still in presence, and we did that without technology, and it was great fun and a great way also to put people in contact and network. But anyway, of course, technology gives a lot of benefits. For example, measurement. Because, as I said at the beginning, if gamification is about changing behaviors, at the end of the day, you want to know where you are on that journey. And it's much easier if you have some technology telling you. So this is one of the many benefits. Another benefit is the possibility to doing things asynchronously. And with that, I mean, if you do gamification in presence, then you need to be there at the same time. So all the things we've been doing at the workshops, you can do asynchronously with other people if you launch challenges like what I said with the elderly. When is the best time for you, and when you want to do it, and when you get the creativity to do it also, because sometimes it is linked with creativity and new ideas and new insights. But even if you do it on your own, like you did, for example, David, you gamified a lot of things in your life, then technology allows you to stop at certain moments and then take up again from where you stopped before, like on the next day, see where you are today. If you have some processes where technology is following your journey, and without technology, I think this would be impossible. So either you do it in one go, which is doesn't make any sense for many things. Like if you want to gamify your health, for example, it takes maybe some months. So if you have some sort of gamification with digital support, then you take over bit by bit and you always know where you are. So this time factor and measurement together, I think you cannot do without technology.
Okay. Thanks very much for that. Thanks very much for that, Lucia. I'm now privileged to speak to Pete Jenkins. I've asked him to join us. I mentioned at the beginning that he's been teaching his students at gamification at the University of Brighton. So, Pete, can I just ask you to say a few words about yourself, and maybe even you plug your Gamification Europe conference that's on next year?
Well, you've given me lots to do there. Thanks for inviting me on. I've got a hard job to do to follow Helen, I think. For those who don't know me, I run a company called Gamification Plus. So we work in consulting, mentoring, and advising companies and organizations on how to apply gamification really well. So strategically, using it right, using the right psychology, that sort of thing. And for my sins, I teach part-time gamification, and I've got some students watching today and hopefully gathering some questions for a debrief afterwards as well. And as David mentioned, I run Gamification Europe, which the next edition is coming up in March. In fact, Lucia has agreed to speak at that. And so has Luke's boss, Gal Rimon. So it'll be a good little day, I think, or a few days where we can do some stuff.
Okay, thanks very much, Pete. I'm pleased that you've joined us. I now want to go into the gallery view, and I want to go to a Q&A session. So you should be able to see all of the presenters on the screen now. And what I'm going to do is to use this as the opportunity to go to Q&A. Now, Pete, you just mentioned debriefing. One of our first questions from David Crookall was, what is the role? Do you think gamification events and processes need debriefing? So, Pete, I'll go to give you a chance to answer that first. Is debriefing useful?
I think it is useful, first off. I think it makes things cheaper quite often, because to scale a game to not need debriefing needs a lot of extra thought. You've got to actually build that into the game itself, or the gamification. And that's quite difficult because everyone's going to think something different. So a facilitator as debriefer is really good at that.
Okay, thanks, Pete. Lucia, what's your view on debriefing?
Well, I would link it very much to the objective of the gamification, because if we're talking about gamifying training or stuff like that, probably it is very useful or sometimes mandatory. I mean, we've been using gamification in other contexts where actually debriefing would be completely out of place. Like if you use gamification to trigger networking or bring people to get in touch and get to know each other, then there's nothing to debrief. So I would link it very much to the objective.
And Luke, what's your view on debriefing?
I think that it's there's definitely times where it's necessary, and I think, look, going back to your last question around technology, what I think that where that technology can have a role to play, particularly in debriefing, is the collection of that data and have the analytics to really deep dive into some of that stuff, which often can be a lot harder if you didn't have that in that space. But look, I think I agree with Lucia. I think you have to go back to the purpose of what you were setting out to do.
Okay, now we've got another interesting question. I did say in the briefing to our panelists that I would do a mystery question so that they didn't have a chance to prepare for it. Well, one of our attendees has actually given a question which I think just fits the bill as a random question. It's a question from Roberto De Simone. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And what he's asking is, have you seen examples where gamification enables or encourages greater collaboration within teams and across partner organizations? So I'm going to go to you, Luke, first. And what's your view on that?
Maybe a slightly different example to in this one, and we recently did a deployment with a large insurer here in Australia, and one of the features that they asked us to do was to allow the store within our platform to not just be able to be purchased for yourself, but also purchased for others. And so that was really interesting, because it all of a sudden added an intrinsic sort of thing to what is, primarily an extrinsic mechanic. And what we found in deploying that, and what this insurer found, is that people were actually purchasing more for other people and the people around them than they were for themselves, and essentially creating this culture within the ecosystem that they created. And I thought that was a really interesting example of how gamification and elements that, you know, potentially this extrinsic thing can become an intrinsic action and bring people together in that scenario and create a culture of, you know, collaboration and just a culture of sharing and looking out for each other.
So you mentioned the idea of ecosystem, because I think this is potentially a very good example of how you can create win-win relationships with gamification. Have you got any thoughts on this, Lucia, on how can you use gamification to encourage people to collaborate with each other?
Well, I have a little bit, but I think that the key point is always personalization, because there is not a standard solution to make people collaborate. You have to find out what kind of people you have, in what scenario they have to collaborate, and against what kind of purpose. So in other words, again, it's a sort of a psychological motivational investigation that you need at the base of such a solution. We are not working a lot into this. I remember a case where a huge industry in Italy asked us exactly for a gamification framework for this topic. And for example, industry, I think, is not really prepared to pay for it. So in other words, they think it's something quite easy to set up, which it is not. So when they start understanding what kind of studies, at least we believe, you need at the background, then they're not prepared to pay for it. So also the project didn't go on. So I guess these are my views on the question.
Pete, what about you? Have you got any thoughts or ideas on how you use gamification to get people to collaborate to the same end?
Well, first of all, I want to agree with Luke. We've done quite a few gamified CRM, customer relationship management, database implementations, and in some of them you can set rewards. And certainly in the UK, one of the most popular sets of rewards was buying stuff for the team. So meals out, experiences, things like that. The most popular reward, by the way, was time off. So that was for individuals. The second set was actually for the team after that. And almost no one went for actual stuff rewards for themselves. And I thought that's really interesting as well. In terms of their encouraging collaboration, I think there's some great examples out there. On my shelf behind me, just there, is a game called Project Ninjas, which is loosely based on Pandemic. So it's a cooperative game. And what I like about this is it's about teaching project management, but also around the different roles involved in a project and valuing each other's role. And it highlights that. And it's really good. And it's a lot of fun to play as well.
So yeah, intrinsic motivation and enjoyment of playing games is fantastic when you can achieve it. But one thing about ecosystems, I'm thinking about some of the tactics that are used commercially. For one example would be Vitality Life, offering the Apple Watch to people who take up their policies and giving them incentives for doing exercises. And if you think of a health ecosystem as a whole, there are lots of stakeholders within an ecosystem. And I've seen examples within Asia, in Malaysia, they have kind of strategic partnerships between the people who run the rail network and the network of pharmacies, where you get points every time you buy something within the pharmacy, and this will gain you travel points on your travel card. And that's just an example of how people are collaborating. I have to bring this into the conversation because it's very, very topical. I saw in the paper today, and this is, I think, is a good example of the idea of a leaderboard. And I'd like to ask your opinion, and possibly the opinion of our participants, of what I'm going to put onto the screen now. So I'm just going to share my screen with you now and ask you what you think of the leaderboard idea here. GPs, the new face-to-face revolution. League tables to shame doctors who won't see patients. This is a headline on our paper, using leaderboards as a motivational factor to influence behaviours and outcomes. I'm going to stop sharing that now. Just ask you for your immediate reactions of that as a strategy and whether it's likely to have unintended consequences, shall we say. Pete, start with you.
Personally, I'm not a fan of it as a strategy. I think it will have unintended consequences. My first thoughts on seeing it were like, oh, good, I'll choose to go to the GP that doesn't see patients and I'll just see them online because they're probably more efficient. And
unintended consequence, yeah.
But no, that sort of league table doesn't really take into account any context. I think that's probably the biggest issue with that. Yeah, what are the things happening behind that? Every little GP area has a different thing going on. So I just don't think it's valuable information.
Okay, Luke?
I don't like it. I think leaderboards have a place. I know that they can be very controversial, but I think that leaderboards, should be based upon the theory that iron sharpens iron, and you should put people on leaderboards that can compete and have the opportunity to compete against each other in a positive way. I think when you start to use leaderboards for evil and you put everyone on one leaderboard and there's always going to be someone at the bottom, you're always going to end up with negative outcomes, negative feelings, and a whole heap of problems that stem from that approach to leaderboards.
Lucia?
Well, I hate it. I think it's exactly the opposite way that we should use gamification. So we should use it to emphasize positive things. I think it's completely out of context, as Pete said, because I guess, for example, digital technology was introduced or is being introduced into healthcare systems in general, exactly for the opposite. So to support patients to be at home and being in contact with the doctor. So this is in a way manipulating communication and giving completely a fake scenario about what is happening out here today.
Okay, we're almost at the closing time, so it's now really my chance to just thank our panelists, including Helen and now Peter, who's joined us, Luke and Lucia. I think we've had a great discussion, and I've certainly gained a lot from being part of this discussion. Before we close, and I will ask you to fill in the feedback form before when you log off. But before we do that, I'd just like to have one more final polling question. And the polling question really is a reprise of the one that I asked at the beginning, to see whether this webinar is that you've actually learned anything from it. So now, after you've heard the webinar, how much do you know about gamification now? And have you ever, now you know what it's all about, have you ever used gamification in your business life and your personal life? I'll share the results with you in a bit. Okay, I'll share the results with you now. So, well, nobody knows nothing, but we have had a bit of a shift towards quite a lot, learning quite a lot about gamification, and more people saying that they've used gamification in their business life and also particularly in their personal lives. We've always used the if you've got any kids, you will have certainly use gamification to encourage them to wash the car or do the shopping for you at some point in your life. So it just remains for me to say thank you for everybody involved, our panelists and also our participants. Would you please now log off? And I'm going to show our closing screens, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Ciao.
Thank you.